Hey everyone, welcome back to the Through the Front Door page. On today's video, we're going to be discussing something that has been much more of a buzzword for the past few years. It's been caricatured, it's been misrepresented. Today's video is called Hot and Cold, Defining and Discussing Triggers. And so the word trigger has many different meanings to many different people. And so before we get into the video, just a public disclaimer. I am not a therapist. I'm not trying to pretend to be a therapist. I'm not offering therapeutic advice. I'm simply just sharing parts of my story that I hope are helpful with you, along with some public definitions by professionals to try to help us come up with a common definition from people who deal with this all the time. And so I want to define what is a trigger. I also want to talk about the four main responses to being triggered as well. There's definitely more than that when you get into kind of the subcategories of trauma and abuses. But for this particular video, we're just going to stick with the main four. And so according to American Psychological Association, a trigger is a stimulus that elicits a reaction. For example, an event could be a trigger for a memory of a past experience and an accompanying state of emotional arousal. And according to Berkeley Wellbeing Institute, triggers are events that happen around us and less often inside of us that cause us to have particular emotional reactions or behave in specific ways. And so either an event or something could happen that could create this experience inside the brain where the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, which is where your intellect and your ability to rationalize and have rationale kind of shuts down in that moment. And where you're living is not up here, so you're not able to see things as objective as normal if you're a full-grown developed adult, as we've talked about in previous videos. But you're living in your limbic, your midbrain, where your emotions and your emotional responses are mostly stored, not all, but mostly. And you're stuck in there. This isn't working properly, you're in here. And the trigger is the event or the events or the experiences that sent you there. And so the four main responses to that, or I should say reactions, your ability to respond to things rationally is kind of lowered, and now you're just in react mode. The four main responses are some we're familiar with, some we're probably not. The first one is fight. And so you're in a situation, you get triggered, and your immediate response is, I feel threatened, I feel fear, I want to eliminate the threat, I'm going to have a physical altercation with the person or things or whatever that are causing me to feel this way until it's eliminated and I can kind of come down from that feeling of being triggered. So that's fight. Second one is flight. Instead of fighting that thing that's causing you to feel that way, you respond with, I need to remove myself from the situation as quick as possible, so that I cannot feel that way anymore and kind of come down from feeling so intense anxiety or fear, whatever you're feeling at that point. The third one is fawn, F-A-W-N, fawn. And this one's more of a codependent response where you try to talk your way out of the situation. You're trying to appease the person or thing that's threatening you and trying to bring the situation, kind of diffuse it with words instead of fighting or fleeing. And then the fourth one is freeze. You just freeze. You don't move, you're not sure what to do, and just boom. And again, this is not something you're thinking about. These things are happening so quickly that when you're triggered, it's boom. That's your reaction. And you lose in some ways your ability to respond rationally. And so just to kind of group them into a couple categories to kind of help us figure out what's going on inside of our bodies at that point, because when we're healthy, we're connected with our minds and our bodies. And so we know what's going on and we can kind of sense, okay, this is what's happening. The fight, flight, and fawn category fall into what's called the sympathetic response, which is elevated blood pressure, elevated heart rate. You can feel yourself getting warmer and your adrenaline kicks on. For some people, depending on their body type, they become very flush. Their face gets really red and you can see like, oh man, this is not a good situation. And so it's kind of like a rocket ship taking off, and just everything is racing, everything is increasing, including your breath. Sometimes you forget to breathe and it's really, really intense. So that's the sympathetic response. And the fight, flight, or fawn fall into that. And that's really important because if you feel yourself getting close to being triggered, you can feel it in your body. If you start to pay attention, you're like, okay, I'm starting to sweat, my heart rate's starting to go up, shortness of breath, my face feels like my blood is pumping through it because the situation's making me feel really whatever. Those are things to pay attention to, which we'll talk about later on, of how to kind of diffuse triggers or recognize them and kind of get out of them before they actually happen, or if they do happen, how do we get out of them? And so that's the first kind of grouping, is fight, flight, or fawn, falls in the sympathetic category. And the second one is called parasympathetic, and that's where freeze falls into. And so depending on how the charts are drawn when you look at these, and I'll kind of attach a link to the charts. There's sympathetic, and then parasympathetic is up here. I like the one where parasympathetic is down here, because it feels more like that, where instead of going up, you dive down into shame, where you're frozen and you just don't know what to do, either in fear or in fear and shame, where your blood pressure comes down, your heart rate comes down, your body temperature comes down, you're very cold, and you just feel the shame, and everything just kind of constricts in, and you just want to not flee physically from it, but you just want to kind of protect yourself from what's happening. And so typically we fall into one of the two responses first, and then if the situation isn't resolved, we resort to the other one. And so if you're sympathetic, you're going hot first, and then if that doesn't work, you just dive down into shame. Or you start down into shame, and then it's what's called poking the bear, which is like they're not getting the response because you're not responding, because you're just in shame, you're just trying to isolate. And eventually just, and then off the rocket ship goes into this fight or leaving or just whatever, trying to get this situation resolved. And so hopefully this has been helpful for you. I just want to leave you with a couple questions as well that have been helpful for me to kind of wrestle through. The first one is, do I recognize a pattern in how I respond to my triggers? We want to try to pay attention to this stuff. When I start to realize, hey, this is what I do in these situations, that way I can do the opposite to try to be more healthy. If I can't get out beforehand, I want to try to get myself out when I'm in it as quick as possible to kind of come back down or come up out of the shame back into the rhythm of health. Second thing is, can I ask someone I trust if they see a pattern in my responses? So if I spend time with either my friends or, for those that are married, if you have a spouse, asking them if they're a safe person for you, asking them the honest question of like, hey, what do you see in my responses in these? And start to pay attention to that and see if there's a pattern there. And the third one is, can I recognize when I'm on the edge of being triggered? Because if I can recognize it, then maybe I can get out of it before I ever get into it. Maybe I can diffuse the bomb before it ever goes off in my brain. So hopefully this has been helpful for you guys. Like I said, I'll attach a chart of fight, flight, fawn, and freeze, along with sympathetic and parasympathetic. Till next time, guys, take care.